Hello, and welcome to Mindscapes, a series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, visions, and philosophy define contemporary India. My guest today is a master storyteller, a connoisseur of the mysterious. From an idyllic mountain retreat, he's seen by many as the guardian angel of Indo-Anglican writing. I'm delighted to welcome Ruskin Bond. Welcome to civilization, in a sense, Ruskin.
Thank you.
We have this sort of, you seem to lead an idyllic life. It's a fantasy of so many people to live in the mountains and write. What is it like?
Well, it was my fantasy 30 or more years ago when I did sort of throw up a job in Delhi and decided I was going to write full-time and freelance, and I thought the best place to do it would be in the hills. And so I knew the Missouri area, and so I decided I'd go up there.
So how idyllic is it for you?
It can be idyllic, but it's not entirely so, and I think it's a fallacy to think that one is going to live in a fairy tale setting and write lots and lots of books and stories, because sometimes either it can be very relaxing and you don't get to work at all, or just the day-to-day business of getting through living makes it just as difficult as it would be down here in a city. Mm-hmm. But I think I'm fortunate in that living in the mountains, you do have access to the natural world more, and you can get out and about. You can go for long walks. You can commune with nature. And if you are receptive to the natural world, it can help you as a writer.
Your writing has that fairy tale like quality, the mysterious, the feeling of nature, of being in touch with that sort of yes. setting yes. of much of your writing. Do you find that that being removed from the engaging and everyday reality of people and the interactions, that somehow solitude is more conducive to writing, or does it deprive you of the raw material?
I think you need something of both. I don't think one should become a total recluse, and nor am I, because I live with a large adopted family of 10 in a very small cottage. The solitude helps now and then, in that you can come face to face with yourself. You can go out and be on your own for some time, and either sort of look inwards a bit. But it's necessary to write about other people too, and for that I think one shouldn't cut oneself off completely.
In the early years of your writing, there was sort of an identity crisis from the outside in looking at who you were and what your writing was, in the sense that, were you an Englishman writing in India, writing about India, set in India? Were you an Indo-Anglican writer? And I think that with the growth and the popularity of Indo-Anglican writing, you are now you're sort of firmly positioned in that genre.
Yes. Because I started writing when I was still in my teens. I was 18.
You published your first novel when you were 18.
Right, and people are usually very mixed up at that age, and I was too. And so it did take me time to find my moorings and to realize where I belonged. And then also those were years, as you say, the late 50s, the 60s, the 70s, when it's not that Indians weren't writing, they were, but they had to look abroad for publishers, because publishing hadn't come of age in India. You had educational publishers, but very few did fiction or novels, or general literature in general. And that all changed in the 80s, and so that now you have a fairly wide variety of publishers, and this gives an opportunity to new young writers to come on the scene here in India without having to plug their wares abroad, though many do get published abroad. But it isn't absolutely necessary now. You can still make a living and a reputation here itself.
To what degree are you able to make a living as a writer, purely as a writer?
Purely as a writer. Well, I've been doing that off and on since I was in my early 20s. It wasn't particularly easy then, but because we had, say, just a handful of magazines and newspapers, and you had to do it then basically through writing for journals and magazines and newspapers. Not so much from books. So it was an up and down affair. And
do you now feel secure and comfortable with?
One is never completely secure as a writer, but certainly I think the gods have been kind to me, and I've been able to do the thing I wanted to do. Basically, I think that's the important part of it.
Going back to this idea of the Indo-Anglican writer or an Indian writing in English, you do have a sort of an Anglo-Indian heritage.
Yes.
And you spent 3 years in London.
Yes.
Trying to make it work.
Yes.
And then came back to India. How have things sort of balanced out for you? You know, that heritage, contemporary India,
Yes.
and being sort of...
Well, I try to, I see it now anyway as a sort of a double inheritance. So I think I've been lucky to have both an Indian and through my parents, or rather to my father, also a certain taste for English literature, which I grew up on. So I maybe I've had the best of both worlds, you could say.
But in terms of, is there a different sensibility of, you know, an Indian writing about India in India?
Yes,
and
because
so what qualities do you think you bring in?
Perhaps because I'm an Indian and I've lived here, and really apart from those 3 years that I spent abroad when I was 17, 18, I write from, at least I think I write from within and inside. So I'm not the outsider looking in, as a Western writer would be doing, but in a way I'm the insider looking out. So I think I see the world through Indian eyes, but perhaps just with a touch of maybe just a little touch of distance, to get things in a sort of perspective of my own.
What about the use of language? You know, not all your writing is located in contexts where English is normally spoken. So in a sense, you're translating to make your writing accessible.
Yes, and because over the years, English in India has changed to some extent. It still has, in many ways, an old-fashioned touch to it, because we still use expressions which might have gone out of use in the West, and at the same time we are using more and more of our own Indian expressions, you know. So I think, and that should be an ongoing process. Language must change, and I think I've also noticed that a lot of writers now don't use italics for Indian words; they just use them as words in English. So I think, which says something too for the English language, in that it can absorb and
you use the word old-fashioned, and in a sense, you know, the universe that you weave and create is somewhat old-fashioned.
It is, because my favorite form of writing is the essay, and that's also perhaps an old-fashioned form. Not many people write essays now, you know. So you could say I'm more in the tradition of a Lamb, or rather than the novel tradition.
How do you go about planning, say, a novel that you write? How does it happen for you?
Yeah, well, since I've only written maybe 2 or 3 novels of any length, perhaps the short story would illustrate better the way I write. I'm a very visual person, perhaps because I grew up on cinema, and so when I want to write a story, I'll see it first. I'll visualize it in my mind from almost from beginning to end, almost as you would on a screen, and then I'd write it and give people their thoughts and dialogue. So it's very much a visual process in the mind.
That is possible in a short story, but
yes, a novel you do need to
does it sort of
develop and
do you sort of plan out a
live
structure
with, live
before
with
you
characters, which is why I'm not such a good novelist. I'm better at the short story. I lose patience with my characters sometimes, or want to finish them off.
You do a lot of writing for children.
I do, yes.
How do you make that switch in being able to relate into what is it that children want? It's a different world, different universe,
right, yes.
different vocabulary.
It is quite a challenge. But when I was young, I took myself seriously, and I wrote for adults. And it was only when I got to the age of 40 that I realized that
you rediscovered your innocence.
Yes, that's when I started writing for children, and I like doing it because not because there's money in it. There isn't. Publishers don't pay very much for children's books, but the response is always very encouraging from readers, from young readers. It's always a joy to meet a young person who has read something of yours, because the response will be frank and direct. He or she will tell you whether they liked the story or didn't like it, and why, and they'll ask you questions about it, and so you get a very honest appraisal too, very often from a boy or a girl. And
you are one of the sort of rare established writers writing for children. Do you think this is something to do with your own turbulent and difficult childhood, the innocence perhaps that you didn't have, and the realities that you had to confront so quickly and early in your life, that you felt an urge and need to reach out to the young?
Yes, because a lot of my early stories, even though written for an adult audience, were about my childhood. And it was a fairly turbulent childhood, because I lost my father when I was very young, and there was a stepfather, and the usual sort of rebellion against adult parents.
And painful moments, is that
all
sort
this
of
sort of
description of you arriving at a railway station after your father.
Yes, right. Yes, there's a lot
lost
of
your father, and
loneliness comes into
yes.
the loneliness of the child comes into the loneliness, and at the same time the self-sufficiency of a child, because you do learn to be self-sufficient if you're left on your own as a young person. But so a lot of it was, I do look back and sometimes write about my own childhood, but it's also come in use now when I write for other children and about other children. So perhaps it helps me to understand their problems, or have an insight into the way they look at the world.
Have you ever felt that that sort of the turbulent childhood that you had was in some senses and in sort of an emotional, psychological baggage that you carried, or has it just provided you rich resource and material as a writer?
Perhaps in the beginning it was a bit of a baggage, but I think over the years it has provided me with a lot of material. And who knows, if I'd had that happy a childhood and everything had gone well, and I'd have taken up a career in some dull profession and never would have been a writer.
Dull
so
profession.
I think sometimes I think if you look at many famous writers, they often did have difficult or turbulent childhoods.
So would you say that in some sort of significant ways, the capacity to experience and internalize and process suffering is intrinsic and necessary for a writer?
I don't suppose it's absolutely necessary, because there have been writers who've also had happy childhoods, but I think it might certainly help the writer to look inward, to be more reflective, sensitive, or if you've been a sensitive boy or girl, to be able to utilize that experience.
How much of of contemporary Indian writing in English do you read? Do you keep in touch with what
I keep in
the
touch,
writers
but
are doing?
I'm not as I'm a very self-indulgent reader, so I read purely for pleasure when I do read, because now with this I find I have to write more and work more than I used to. And as a boy I was a terrific bookworm. I read a tremendous amount. And now it's just, okay, an hour a day. So I try to keep in touch, because I don't want to look a fool and be ignorant about contemporary writers. So I do.
Do you derive pleasure from it, or do you do just to keep in touch with what other people, your peers, are doing?
Sometimes I derive pleasure from it too, yeah.
So what are some of the outstanding sort of books that have given you pleasure?
In recent times?
Yes. The Arundhati Roy, Vikram Seth, Amitabh Ghosh, the sort of the contemporary band of successful Indian writers in
yes,
English.
Probably they're all very talented, but the one that probably I can relate to or read with pleasure would probably be, I would say, Vikram Seth. The reason being because he is, I think, the one modern Indian writer, or so one of the few modern writers, not just in India, who also write poetry. That's very rare nowadays to find a novelist who writes poetry, a prose writer who writes poetry. Usually you will get poets, or you get novelists, or you get historians or essayists. And to think, when you think back about writers who also were poets, you have to go back to Tagore, or it's hard to think of them,
Sure.
So to have that facility to write both verse and prose, I think is a special kind of gift.
Do you think that brings, in what ways does that bring a special quality to the writing, to have a poetic sensibility?
Yes.
Gives you a special facility with words, so that the quality of your writing is more
yes, makes it more lyrical, and so the appeal it would be to me, since I am fond of poetry too. So yes, I think it gives you the ability to go beyond the contemporary, perhaps.
I think your writing has the poetic quality, particularly in its description of ambience and setting and landscapes.
In my prose writing,
enormously
it does come out, I think. And
poetic.
Though I've written a little verse, it's not any great volume or significance.
Your writing also has it looks frequently at, and in a very accepting kind of way, unrequited love. Do you feel, how important is love for you?
Very important, though perhaps the stories of unrequited love were written when I was in my 20s and 30s and was constantly meeting with unrequited love. But I've
since
so now I would say I receive a different kind of love from family, or from children, and which is not romantic love, but you could say a sort of deep, abiding affection from someone who's grown up in front of you or beside you.
Do you feel that sort of the early years of your life and sort of adolescence and 20s and 30s that you talked about, as with the case of, and you have been compared in some ways to D.H. Lawrence's writings and his sort of struggle with trying to define, explain, understand the many notions of love.
Yes.
Has that been a struggle for you too?
Not perhaps as much as it should have been. Maybe
Why do you say should have been, or might
because
have been?
I don't think maybe I've perhaps gone as deep within myself as I could have over the years in my writing. But perhaps it's an aspect I might still be able to write about.
So what are the sort of human values that you cherish most in other people and aspire to attain in yourself?
A loving nature in anybody, care for, gentleness, because it's not a quality one finds everywhere or easily, and somebody who I would admire always someone who, you could say, acts impeccably or aims, if doesn't, none of us acquire perfection, but who aims at it or and does his best in whatever field he is.
Do you feel comfortable that in your writing and in the process of creating your work, which has a quality of impeccable detailing and precise precision,
yes,
that you have achieved this perfection, or do you go back sometimes and feel despair that, oops, if I could get my publisher to sort of reprint that page?
No, I try to do my best to make a thing work as well as I can, and nothing is ever perfect.
Are they compromises because you write to make a living?
Compromises along the way, very few, very few. I've often turned down lucrative offers simply because I thought I'd be bored to death doing that kind of book or that kind of work. And I've never changed a thing. The Room on the Roof was my first novel, which I wrote when I was 18. And looking at it now, I can see it's in parts very naive and gauche, but it was the work of a
18-year-old
adolescent, writing about his adolescence. So that's what gives it its unique quality. So I've never tried to touch it up or change anything in it. Maybe now, today, writing something, I would work on it, or feel it's not good this way and change it around, or even tear it up. But those things that I did when I was very young, I don't like to change them.
Obviously, for a writer, both are important. The craft and the insight and the ability to articulate into complex internal processes and the perceptions of life. How do the two marry together for you? Is it a spontaneous act of writing what comes up for you?
Yes.
Do you spend time crafting it? How much crafting do you do?
It's basically spontaneous in me, because that's why I started so young, because the urge to write was always there. And I began writing by keeping a journal, and I still keep a journal. And I find this helps a great deal. I mean, it's not that I have to publish the journal, but it often, you can look back on something you put down, or and that can become a story. Even the journal itself can become
useful resource material for future sort of critics and people who evaluate and look at your work.
Useful to other writers too. And I enjoy reading other people's journals, and particularly diarists. So it is spontaneous, but I also do, particularly when writing for children. Now, with a children's book, I think craft comes into it more, because when you're writing for an adult,
you're equating with them as peers.
You can be self-indulgent, and an adult reader will even be patient with you for maybe 2 or 3 chapters before he decides you're not readable. But with a child reader, they'll only give you up to the bottom of page 1, or maybe, if they're very kind, page 2, before they throw the book away. So you really got to catch their attention and tell a good story, and and keep them with you. So their craft comes into it.
When you write, is it because you feel you have something to say to the rest of the world, or you have something that you need to get out of your system?
I think both to some extent. I do sometimes want to get things out of my system, and at the same time, writing is it is
Cathartic?
communication too. It's one must communicate, and I always have in my mind the sort of the ideal reader. You know,
Who is the ideal reader for you?
it's hard to say, but you know, maybe it's a projection of oneself. You know, but you always, because you can't be writing into a void, so you got to, when you're writing, you feel.
Do you have a mental image of communicating to someone?
Not really a mental image, because it's not a physical image, you see.
Right.
So, but it's a reader who maybe you've been once, you know, who you feel is going to enjoy this. Or
do you define that person in some way in terms of education, background, sex, location?
Probably quite sexless, but I guess maybe the sort of reader I was once, maybe, you know. When I read everything.
Do you write with a sense of history? You know, you look back, you know, 4 decades later at, you know, the work you did as an adolescent, and you know, people will look at it for the next 50 years, 100 years, we don't know how many centuries later. Do you write with a sense of history that this is prose frozen in time?
Well, I suppose most writers do in a way, because if we're also readers, we are reading books that were written in the 18th or 19th centuries, and you're reading them today, and we can go backwards and forwards with their work. So just occasionally you feel perhaps it's just possible that somebody might sit down and read something I've written 50 years hence. On the other hand, I often go through the library shelves and see hundreds and hundreds of authors who are long forgotten and nobody reads anymore, which can be a bit discouraging too. So you have to keep some sort of balance. It's not as though it's going to confer immortality on you. Or
so what would you like sort of someone browsing through the shelf 50 years from now, or what would you like history to say of you as a writer?
I would like maybe a child browsing through a library shelf to pick up one of my books and enjoy reading it. So maybe what I would really like to do is perhaps write a children's classic, you know, which could give pleasure to generations of children.
Mr. Ruskin Bond, thank you very much. That's been a great privilege.
So, thank you.